kick off the session by giving just a kind of a brief welcome and giving you each a minute or two to introduce yourselves, and then we'll get into the questions. Does that sound reasonable? Great. Okay. So thank you very much for joining us on today's session on inclusion in global science and how to prevent parachute research. And part of the panel today, we have three members. We have Dr. George Vousden from PLOS. We have Dr. Thumbi Ndung'u who's the director of the Basic and Translational Science Africa Health Research Center in South Africa. And we have Celi, who's the editor-in-chief of PLOS Digital Health and is affiliated with MIT in the US. Welcome to all three of you. And can I give you a moment to each introduce yourselves and your backgrounds and what brings you to this topic of trying to prevent parachute science?
I guess I'm happy to go first. So yeah, my name's George Vousden. I work on PLOS One, so I'm a journal editor, and I've been here for around 4 years. The main sort of reason that I'm interested in this is that I've been working with others, and Thumbi and Leo have been involved in this policy on a new policy on parachute science and global research and things like that. So I think I have a sort of a professional interest in that way. And it's something that I've been working on for about 1.5 years or so. So I'm really interested to talk a little bit more about it, and especially with members of the community and so
on. Let's go to you next.
Okay, I'm Thumbi Ndung'u, and I'm Director for Basic and Translational Science at the Africa Health Research Institute. I'm also a professor at the University of KwaZulu-Natal in Durban, South Africa, but also a professor at University College London in the United Kingdom. In my research, I do a lot of collaborative work with a lot of partners, and as a result of my sort of wide network of researchers, this issue about parachute science and what constitutes equitable partnerships and collaborations in global health is an issue that I've had to grapple with, and hence my interest in this particular area of science and how science is practiced globally.
Great, thank you. And Leo.
And my name is Leo. I'm an intensive care physician at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center here in Boston. The research is based at the MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And I think that one of the reasons that I'm personally interested in this topic is because what we have been lamenting for really the last decade is this very unequal map of the medical knowledge system. We think that this is a big contributor to all the problems that we see, that there's not a lot of people represented on the table in terms of deciding what are the best tests and treatments for populations around the world. There are very few academics who are sitting at that table, and the voice of the rest of the world is really not heard. And we're hoping that this is something that we can change over the next few years, because all our efforts in global health over the last 50 years have barely moved the needle. We're facing the same problems as we did decades ago, despite the fact that we have poured billions of dollars into global health.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction to this topic. So to kick things off, I'd like to ask your three perspectives on what is parachute science? What are we talking about with this issue?
So I guess maybe I can just start, I guess, with a bit of a dictionary definition of what that really is. So parachute research, I think this also referred to as things like helicopter or neo-colonial science. So this is where research will fly into countries, and often these are under-resourced countries. They'll perform their research with little or poor understanding of the local considerations and minimal involvement of local stakeholders. And then once they've completed that research, they'll fly out and often write up the paper. And there are huge problems with this, and maybe I'll leave Leo and Thumbi to talk a bit more about them, of scientific and ethical concerns as well. But I think maybe there's another phrase that's maybe sort of useful to add in for this discussion. So parachute research is sort of this is where there isn't adequate involvement of local stakeholders and so on. But I don't think that covers all research. And I think that you can have sort of what I call global research. And this is just research conducted in other countries. And I think that this, not all global research is necessarily parachute research. And I think that international collaborations are useful, and it is a good thing to involve people from different countries in research, so long as you have that adequate involvement of stakeholders and so on. So yeah, I think that's maybe a distinction that might be useful for the remainder of the discussion.
Julia, I can see you've unmuted. Would you like to add to what George has said in terms of your definition there, and the problems that you've seen in your research?
I think simply put, I would say that parachute science is science that is done or conducted primarily to benefit individuals or institutions in resource-rich countries. So it's mostly focused on benefiting either those institutions or individuals, with very little regard for the impact of that science on local communities in terms of either making society better or even empowering institutions and communities in low and middle income countries. So, and that it's not just the impact of the research, but also even the processes that are done, because sometimes the research itself can have potential or perceived beneficial impact in resource limited settings, but the processes that through which the research is conducted end up just empowering or disempowering communities and researchers and institutions in low and middle income countries at the expense, or empowering those in the resource rich countries at the expense of those in resource poor settings. So it really goes everywhere from conception of the research to the way the research is conducted to the impact of that research and who stands to benefit the most from the way the research is conducted.
I think that's a really interesting perspective about who stands to benefit the most, if it's the local communities or if it is the authors who have come to these communities to conduct the research. Leo, did you want to expand upon that?
Yes, and I think I'm going to be pushing the button a little bit more. I think that this parachute helicopter medicine science is really an offshoot of the patriarchal nature of academic medicine and academia as a whole. And if I may say, it's an offshoot of the narcissism, the academic narcissism that we know what's best for the rest of the world. We are experts in this field, and we will tell you what you need. We will tell you the solutions, and then everything will fall in place because we are the experts. And I think that this is sort of the exhaust of that attitude that is, I hate to say it, kind of prevalent still, and has been plaguing us for the last decades.
So how can we prevent parachute science then? Are there specific roles that the journals can play, for example, or funders, or research ethics committee, institutions? Where do you see the various responsibilities here? Leo, go ahead. Or George, yeah.
I think from our perspective, I think the responsibilities for stopping parachute science lies at all levels of research, whether it's the funders who are funding the research or the practitioners of the research themselves, the researchers themselves. I think communities have a responsibility in this area as well. And there are sort of institutions, whether it could be research ethics committees or other oversight bodies that may be established, particularly in those resource limited settings. But I think also other stakeholders such as journals have a really important role to play. So I would say it's the responsibility for how to stop it, obviously, it can be widely shared, and there's no one single person or institution that can be blamed for this, but I would say that a huge part of the responsibility particularly lies with the researchers and institutions in resource-rich countries. And I say that carefully because I don't want to say that they should be the ones to kind of drive the agenda, because then that would then I think that as long as they continue to drive the agenda, it makes it much more difficult to change things. So perhaps it should be more individuals and institutions in low and middle income countries, but with the realization that because of their limited resources, there's still a huge part of responsibility that lies with those in resource-rich countries.
George, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, you know, I obviously work for PLOS One, so I think it'd be good to talk a bit more about what I think journals can do. But if it doesn't sound too pessimistic, I think I might start off by talking about what journals can't do. I think one of the things that's important to consider, you know, Thumbi, you talked about how there's so many sort of steps of the research, and all of those, you know, individuals in each of those are involved in them. And one of the things I think that's important to acknowledge is that when research comes to a journal, it's the data's already been collected, the paper's already been written. So, you know, certainly in the research that we receive, we can't prevent the parachute science happening because it's already taken place. Those problems of inadequate involvement of local stakeholders and so on, that's already happened at the time when the manuscript is submitted to the journal. So, you know, there are limitations, certainly in sort of the short term as to what journals can do. But I think that there are things that we can do. And as I mentioned at the start, we have been working on a new policy in this area. And what we really want to do with this policy is try and improve awareness of the problems around parachute research. And, you know, as I said, I don't think this is something that's going to help overnight, but I hope that we can start the conversation and start thinking about preventing this from happening in the future. So what this policy is that researchers that are doing research in another country or also another community, so we include, you know, research in indigenous communities and so on, individuals doing that type of research, so that's that broad global research umbrella that I mentioned earlier, those individuals will be requested to complete an additional questionnaire, and that includes various questions of areas that through consultation, and Thumbi and Leo, as I mentioned, you've helped out with this policy. So that questionnaire includes items that we think through that consultation process, we think are important things to consider as part of research in other countries. So it has questions like, how have you involved sort of local members of the community and speaking to them? How are the results of the research going to be shared with people within that community? There's also things about benefits sharing. So, you know, if there are particularly financial benefits arising from the research, how are those benefits going to be shared and so on. So, you know, for the time being, this is to improve reporting. My hope is that really we're going to, you know, move the needle in this area and make this more of a part of the submission process and raise awareness of these things. And, you know, when we get submissions, someone might have to put some not great answers on there of, you know, no, we didn't really adequately involve people. And I think that the way that potentially prevents parachute science is that when they come to do their next study, they'll be thinking, oh, well, I'm going to have to fill in that questionnaire and I want to make sure that, you know, I've got some great answers to that. And the answers are going to be published in the supporting information file, so it will be part of the published record. And certainly the intention is that in the long term, we can hopefully move the needle a bit and really bring these issues to the fore.
Yeah. So George, oh, sorry, go ahead, Leo.
No, I was just gonna echo that because I think it's a very important message. So I actually disagree that it's too late by the time that the people submit their manuscript. But as George pointed out, it's not too late for the next manuscript. If we make this a policy now in the journals, we know that we will change the way people do their research the next time around. That if they know that the journals are going to say that we will not publish your paper unless you really involve the people who participated in the research, then that will have a huge impact over the next few years. And then from the other stakeholder standpoint, I think there's a lot that is happening now that is hoping to, as you say, move the needle or make an impact. The NIH, the National Institute of Health, for example, is funding research projects now where the submitting institution would be a low and middle income country. So they're moving away from awarding this grants to public health schools in the United States. They want the submitting institution to really come from the partner low and middle income country, so that there is a focus on capacity building. So again, this is just reframing now what global health should be. Global health is not about dropping off some solutions, building a hospital, building a laboratory service, but it's more about capacity building. Can we make sure that there is, and I hate the word upskilling. It's not upskilling, it's cross-pollination, because we are learning as much as our partner countries in Asia, in LATAM. I think the word upskilling is completely erroneous at that point. So again, there are so many projects right now where the objective is to create capacity on the ground, build innovation hubs on the ground, and not send some experts there to spend a few weeks and design the solution and roll it out and then leave. Because we know that that approach has not worked in the last 50 years. And I think thinking that there will be some miraculous outputs now when we have not transformed the way we problem solve is, I think that's your definition of insanity according to Einstein.
And Leo, touching on a point that you made earlier too, I think that, in the United States, there are clear issues with some of the infrastructure, right, with water, clean water supplies and the electrical grid, where, the US stands to gain access and information and knowledge from communities around the world about how they manage supply of even clean water in some communities. So I think that this is a really exciting development here that seeks to make access to knowledge, access to information more equitable and improve the flow of knowledge and information around the world. So George, you're mentioning that this policy that PLOS will be rolling out fairly soon. Can I just ask, how are we identifying parachute science in published papers or in papers that are under consideration? What are readers going to be looking for? What are the editors looking for in these papers?
Yeah, so I guess that comes to that difference that I was mentioning earlier of the difference between global research and parachute research. And certainly the intention with this policy is that certainly at initial submission, we're not going to be making a decision as to whether something is parachute research or not. Instead, the first sort of decision point is whether it's global research or not. And the way that we'll be making that decision is based on who the authors are, basically. So if we have a paper that's conducted in, is conducted in a low and middle income country, but actually all the authors are from the USA or something. So those are the sorts of papers that we'll be applying this policy to. So it would be if the research has been conducted in another country and there isn't someone who's the first, last, or corresponding author, we may be requesting that policy. And the decision as to whether it's parachute science or not is much more difficult and much more nuanced than that easy sort of looking at the author list. And we'll be really relying on the peer review process to consider that. So, you know, all PLOS journals have an expectation that research is conducted with appropriate ethical approval and also with integrity. And I think that the expectations of local involvement in stakeholders, they're going to vary between different fields. And PLOS publish articles in 200 different research areas. So it's really challenging for us as a journal to set universal standards across all of those as to what counts as adequate local involvement and so on. So really we'll be leaving that to the community, and that's how peer review is done. Obviously, members of the community will need to decide based on the answers to that questionnaire whether that research has been conducted ethically or not. Yeah, so that's how the policy, at least at launch, will be implemented and enforced.
And Thumbi and Leo, can I ask for your perspectives as researchers and scientists when you're reading the literature? How do you identify these papers? And you know, do you follow up on them? Is it, you know, what's your reaction to seeing this in the literature?
I mean, I think it's very troubling. And I must applaud PLOS for this initiative to try and move the field forward this way. I'm not quite sure that it goes far enough. It's a good start, but we all know that also peer review is incredibly, can be an incredibly incestuous, if I may use that word, process sometimes with, so to what extent reviewers of journal articles will be able to say, no, this looks like parachute research and call out to their colleagues is somewhat is doubtful, but it is nevertheless, I acknowledge that it is a good start to want to require that. I think one of the ways to identify is obviously through authorship. I think it's very important that people who have done the work be acknowledged. And so if the work is really being you know, done and led by people in resource-rich countries, and the work is all focused on resource limited countries, then of course there is a problem there. So anytime I see a journal article that is coming from you know, a research poor setting, and the lead author and the senior author are from research, you know, resource-rich countries, that for me is always a red flag. It doesn't mean that it is always parachute science, but I think because I think we need to be careful. There could be instances where that represents genuine collaborative effort between groups, but certainly those are some of the red flags to look out for. If you see a pattern where people are publishing continually research and data from resource limited settings, and yet you have always, you know, colleagues from these richer settings being the lead and senior authors, that's definitely, I think what we should be looking for is more patterns than events. And if you see patterns, then you know that this is likely to, you know, to be problematic.
Yeah, no, and I just want to build up on that. One of the projects that our group is performing or involved in is just to measure. So among global health papers that have been published over the last 10 decades, what is the proportion of the first and the last authors come from low and middle income countries? Because if we are to really pursue that objective that global health is all about capacity building, what we would like to see is that global health research gets taken over by investigators from low and middle income countries. So we're gonna come out with a baseline measurement of the involvement of investigators from low and middle income countries as first and senior authors now. And we're gonna continue measuring this over time. Perhaps we could have a new index for journals who are supposedly featuring global health in terms of how much have they done in terms of moving the needle? Is there, whatever index you want to call it, is their inclusion index improving over time in terms of showcasing the work of investigators from low and middle income countries?
That's a really interesting point, that we're looking for data to add so that we can actually see changes, we can see trends, to monitor progress and monitor change. I guess I'd like to ask you, we talked a little bit about the institutions, journals, the institutions themselves, and also researchers, especially in low and middle income countries, the role that they might have in addressing positive, causing positive change to ending this practice. What, in your perspective, are the enablers right now of parachute science? So what are we looking for, in terms of stopping this practice so that we actually see the change, measurable change, as Leo just mentioned?
I might lose my job if I'm frank in my answers, but definitely academic institutions have to play a big role in changing the way we do global health research. As I said, the focus should be on capacity building. It's not the solutions themselves, because solutions are a dime a dozen. And we know that the solutions are not going to be sustainable or scalable unless there's a true buy-in, a true ownership of that solution from the ground. And the way that this can really be implemented is through having academic institutions make a commitment that this is as well their objective. It's not about getting the funding from the NIH or the Wellcome Trust for their institution. It is about making sure that at some point they will play a minor role in global health research, that it's not about them being the prominent leaders in the field, but really empowering their colleagues in low and middle income countries.
I would have to add to that list of institutions, funders, because I think funders facilitate this kind of unequal partnerships a lot. You've got a lot of funders who ring fence the money for only people from resource-rich countries. Even when the research is addressing problems that are in, for example, the global South. And I've never understood that personally. You see a lot of funding going to investigators based in, high, sort of profile institutions in the global North. And, sometimes they say that they have no partnerships with with the researchers in resource limited settings. And some institutions are even proud of that. They say, we can't find anybody to work with, there who has expertise in that. Or even they partition certain niche areas of research and say, if it's, for example, basic science, we can't find somebody in Africa, but we can only find somebody in Boston or some other place. And I think that for me, this perpetuates this culture of parachute science. What we need to be doing is to ask, what are we doing to change the landscape over time and to improve the capacity of people in those countries to be able to be actively involved in research? Could we find innovative ways like ring fencing money that goes specifically, or schemes that go specifically to people in resource limited settings, to enable them then build the capacity to do that and to collaborate in an equitable fashion with people in resource rich countries. And again, as Leo said, I think that the institutions themselves where these researchers come from, of course, work in cahoots with the funders, because they will be the ones that are very quick to go for these grants and want these grants actually to go to them rather than. So it becomes a game of really just entrenching the strength and the capacity that already exists in those institutions rather than actually solving very important global health problems.
So I think that's an interesting point that you just raised about these entrenched practices that we have. And I was just going to ask your perspective on how you have seen the practice of parachute science change in recent years, or if you have seen it change. Is it more or less prevalent, or are people paying more or less attention to it now than they were maybe 5 to 10 years ago?
I think there's certainly a lot of attention being paid to this now, and there is a globe towards, there's a big move towards decolonizing global health, which I think is a great thing. There is, for example, with one of the major funders, and I hope it's okay to mention them, the Wellcome Trust, for example, has had this initiative with the African Academy of Sciences to shift the center of gravity, what they call shifting the center of gravity, where funding is actually being given directly to investigators through the Deltas program, of which I'm one of the beneficiaries, to investigators in low and middle income countries. And in fact, the idea is that even the money itself is given to the African Academy of Sciences so that it is administered by an African institution, for example, so that they determine who they want to fund, they determine what mechanisms, what processes they will follow in order to fund research on these important problems in resource-limited settings. So these are the kinds of initiatives that I would like to see more of, funders being proactive about shifting the center of gravity to sort of place the money where the problems actually exist, rather than placing it in other places for those people to come and address problems elsewhere.
I'm just gonna pick up on the word decolonizing, which reminds me of colon cleansing, given my medical background, and that is exactly what we're doing, is colon cleansing and decolonizing. And I'm just gonna repeat what I mentioned earlier. So apart from Wellcome Trust, the NIH as well has several of these initiatives where the funding goes to a low and middle income country. They are the one who administers the grant award themselves. And then not only are the big funders, so the philanthropic organizations, the nonprofit organizations are doing the same thing. So I have been speaking with like Novartis Foundation and Norsken House, and they are establishing a physical innovation hub in Kigali, Rwanda, that will open by the end of the year. And the idea here is to replicate the models in Boston, Cambridge, and Silicon Valley, where you have this organizations that will help incubate some of the entrepreneurs and bathe them in the academic environment. Because I was telling them that the success of the startup ecosystem in places in the United States is because of the fact that they are firmly entrenched in the academic environments, and that is clearly a requirement. So I think that there are definitely more efforts now to try to decolonize or colon cleanse what we have been doing in global health. And those are definitely, those make us optimistic in the people who are in this field.
That's terrific. So what does success look like as a result of these funding initiatives that you both discussed?
George, I could see you started to think of some answers.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'd be the best person to talk about the, unfortunately, maybe I'm no longer involved in the science and the funding of it, and I'm not involved in the research. So I think I'd probably hand that one back to you two.
I mean, for me, I would like to see more funding directly going towards investigators in low and middle income countries. as principal investigators, as funding directly going to them rather than them being asked to corroborate with researchers in resource-rich countries. I would like to see more local ownership of research and research programs. So this idea of big universities in the West going to establish a center in a poor African country, I think it's more, and bringing sort of experts there to sort of come and do the research is becoming much more outdated in my view. And of course, the end result at the end of the day, what we want to see is to see publications coming from these countries, with people in these countries being the lead and senior authors of the research that is coming out of there. And eventually, we want to see societal impact. We want to see science-based jobs, an industry, an industry that is growing for science-based economies in these countries. Eventually, that would represent success. We want to see that the next time we have a COVID-19 type situation, researchers in some of these countries, as a result of these investments, that has shifted the center of gravity of research, that they can now begin to develop and contribute meaningfully, develop their own vaccines, develop drugs, have a real kind of enterprise, a scientific enterprise that is going in these resource limited countries, which is what we have not been able to see over the last 50 years of investment, the small investment that has come through Western-based institutions, for example.
I think that's a really, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm just going to extend what Thumbi said. So we want to see more peer reviewers coming from low and middle income countries. We want to see more section associate editors-in-chief coming from low and middle income countries. And then from an educational perspective, we want more online courses also being designed and put together by our colleagues in low and middle income countries, because the talent is there. As we go around promoting health data science, we realize that the talents are there already. The problem is that they're all within their own silos. The environment is not nurturing enough for them to really step up to the plate. The opportunities are not there as well for them to create their own educational curriculum that they broadcast to the rest of the world, the way that the large institutions here in the United States, for example, would have the opportunity to do so. So I think, to me, that is what success would look like, that this knowledge system is more equally distributed, that it is not 90% controlled by high-powered institutions here in the US or in the UK or other Western countries. And I'm hoping that with all the initiatives that we have mentioned today, that we are moving towards that direction.
I think that's a really positive and really strong vision for the future. And I think, in the course of this conversation, we've highlighted roles that many different organizations, many different institutions can play in trying to address an issue that's fairly entrenched. And Leo, I'm interested in seeing what your data show, your baseline measurements, and how we make changes, to this problem in the coming years. I think we're going to wrap up here. I want to take a moment to thank all three of you for your time today in talking about issues around parachute science and inclusivity and representation in global research. Thank you very much for your time. It's been a pleasure.
So
Thanks.
Thank you.